So it's now gone 4 o'clock, and I'm going to welcome anyone that's out there to join the webinar. Thank you for giving up time to spend it with us this afternoon. I'll just show you who I am. You should be able to see me at this point. So I'm Colin Newbold, welcome. If you are out there and you can see the chat box on the webinar screen, can you please just answer the questions that are on the chat box? In other words, tell us who you are, tell us where you're located, geographically, who you work for, and your role. And most important, what you want to get out of this session, your objectives for the session. While that's going on, I'm going to bring up a slideshow. So let's just put that in place. Okay. I'm joined on the webinar by Belinda Kiley. So for the moment, we are able to see the slides and me. And if I do this, I think everyone will see Belinda.
Hello.
So Belinda Kiley is joining us on the webinar. And I'm just going to go back to the slides. The reason I'm hesitating is because no one has, I was about to say no one has responded to the chat questions, and suddenly we have Dr. David Clive Price, so London DCP Global Coaching, Global Executive Coach, and learning more about 360 techniques. So welcome, Dr. David Clive Price. Welcome, David. You may have seen just briefly there my colleague, Belinda Kiley, who's with us on this webinar. And I will go back to the slideshow just for a second. In actual fact, no, I'll put myself back up there. So that's me. So hi, David, welcome. And you've got sound and visual. That's reassuring. That's good. And we have a slideshow, which I'm going to cover on the webinar. Belinda and I will talk through that at various points. But I also have a report, a sample 360 report. And prior to going live on the broadcast, we were able to see that. Belinda and I were on the webinar 10 minutes or so before the start. We were making sure the technology was working. Sadly, as I went live, the software has somehow objected to me showing my browser screen, which means I can't share the report, which is a bit of a blow, and it wasn't what we planned. I might try and find a way around that as we progress. But right now, I welcome you, David. Anyone else out there, would they please just respond to the questions in the chat box? If you scroll up to the top, you'll see the questions. Just give us a sense of who you are, where you're located, who you work for, your role, and what you want to get from the session, your objectives for the webinar. And once we know who we're talking to, we can get started. David, even though we had 15 registrants for the webinar, you are so far the only attendee. So I don't think we should delay you any longer. We should get started. So first of all, a brief introduction. Let me go back to the slides and bring those up. You'll see the title slide. And if I move to the second slide, you'll see a picture of my good self and Belinda Kiley. So just to give you a little bit of background, my role in TLC Online is the CEO, and the buck stops with me. My claim to fame, I guess, is that I'm the chief architect behind the Click360 brand. And for those of you who don't know my company, we're on a mission to improve the capability of leaders and managers right across the globe. And our vision is not to rest until we see the day when employees, wherever they work and at whatever level, get the bosses they deserve. Now, one of our lead coaches is Belinda Kiley. She's an experienced coach, particularly with 360-degree feedback, and she's got a strong reputation for helping participants to maximize the benefits they get from a 360 experience. Belinda, please say hi and introduce yourself.
Hi, David, and whoever else is out there. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today. I, as Colin said, have been a coach for many years and involved in leadership development for many years, have also run a business and have had a traditional HR corporate career. 360 has been a really valuable tool that I've used throughout my professional career, and I see it as an amazing way to actually open the door and start a longer term development or coaching program. So I initially came to Click 360 as a client.
Let me now move to the webinar objective. Not all of you are 360 clients of ours, and therefore, although our product is Click 360, we want this session to be as generic as possible. Our intention is therefore to help you with any 360 report. You're all on the right webinar, yes? We believe that it's not enough just to send the participant their individual 360 feedback report and then hope that they will somehow magically improve. We recommend that you provide them with a coach or an internal colleague. You may indeed be a coach or a colleague. David, I know you are, that's trained for the purpose of helping the participant to understand and make the most of their 360 report and the associated coaching. Oh, by the way, participant is the label that we give to the person whose 360 this is. In other words, the person at the center, the one getting the report. And our main focus on this webinar is on how to help you as a 360 feedback coach prepare for the first session and deliver that session. And before we start, let's just check a few things out. If you scroll down on your screen, you'll be able to open up a poll section. Now you should see it as I raise it up on the screen here. We've got a very simple poll, and we've got 100% yes to this poll. Can you scroll to the next question you have already? 7 to 9. Okay, interesting. That was the verdict from the two of you. And therefore, if you go to the score below, sorry, the poll below, can you please tell us what would have taken it to a 10 by selecting one of the choices on screen, or if none of those choices really fit, could you use the chat box to tell us what would have taken it to a 10? So both of you have selected the other option. So I'll be interested to see what you write into the chat box, because it would help us to pinpoint content on this webinar that's relevant to the answers you write in to the chat box. Percy, also, if you get the opportunity to tell us a little bit more about who you are, where you're from, where you're located as well, and what you want to get from this session, that would be helpful. Now, Percy's already responded to the poll, and he's written, I have used a 360 feedback process, but it's been conducted without a tool. That's interesting. Okay. And it was through interviews with participants, which I call the platinum approach, where budget is less pressurized. That is, without a doubt, the creme de la creme of 360 experiences. Because, you know, an experienced coach interviewing participants and presumably the raters for those participants. Rater, by the way, is the name it's a label that we give to people that are providing feedback to participants. Through those interviews, you can dig deeper. You can qualify some of the comments, some of the feedback, and that would give you a very rich pool of data to go back to the participant with. And Percy's just told us he's a coach and he lives in Florida, USA. Great. Welcome, Percy. Okay. I'm still hoping that we'll get a response from David, that he's still with us. David, I'm assuming you've also hit the button that said other in relation to the question. But anyway, let's move on. This webinar, by the way, is being recorded. David knows this because David unfortunately can't hear Belinda, but he will hear her voice. I'm confident that he will hear her voice on the recording. So you'll get the recording link automatically by email, but there's no need to take screen grabs or make copious notes. Also, if at any time you wish to raise a question or an observation or a suggestion, can you please use the chat function? And between us, Belinda and I will keep monitoring the chat box and we'll respond accordingly. Okay, let's go back up to the slides and let me ask. David's responded. What would have added or brought the experience score up to a 10 is interviews and the feedback tool. Okay. I think obviously this is a one-way session. I can't hear you, David, but it would be helpful if you could expand on that. You say interviews. What would have helped you? The 360 experience, the participant would have been interviews. Is that the same thing that Percy has referred to, where the 360 was done through interviews rather than through a feedback tool? Or it seems to be maybe that you're suggesting both of those would have been good. I think that's an interesting approach. It's not one that we've ever offered. We've always been, I suppose, I think it would be fair to say at the budget end of the 360 spectrum. But I do think that approach is fantastic if the client can afford it. Feedback tool could be an adjunct to the interviews perhaps with a select group of key stakeholders in that participants network, and the feedback tool as well. You've given me an idea there, both of you, Percy and David, for perhaps a platinum version of our approach. But anyway, that's not the purpose of this webinar. It's to help you get the most out of helping someone be coached around their 360 report. And this is the way that we're going to run the session. So we want to talk a little bit about the setup. How do you prepare, and how does the participant prepare for a 360 feedback session? Session number 1, as you'll see, which is all about understanding what the report is telling the participant. Number 2, we'll talk about the role of the facilitator or coach. In this case, you're both coaches, you'll work one-on-one with participants. Do's and don'ts are really aimed more at the participant than you as the coach, but it would be worth covering some of those. And the report itself, now this is where we're going to struggle a bit, because unfortunately the technology is not allowing me to share my screen, only the slides, and where I choose the screen camera of me and Belinda. But we'll finish with some next steps. So David has thrown in another response to the poll question, which was what would have brought the experience to a 10. I think what you're saying is you're qualifying what you wrote earlier. So debriefing the results of the feedback tool with the coachee in an in-depth interview. Okay, gotcha. That is so important. I'll be talking about this in just a moment. So whether you're conducting your feedback session face-to-face or virtually, there are some vital steps to prepare. We'll consider what those are. We'll also consider, what your role is. How much you gain from this will be entirely dependent on your current experience as a coach and a 360 feedback coach in particular, but we'll try to cover this in as much or as little detail as you collectively need. The do's and don'ts, as I've said, are more for the participant than you. The report section will not feature a report. I wanted to use that, but I can't show it to you. So we'll do it blind, but we'll try and cover how we approach the report feedback session, how to coach around it. And that's where I will invite Belinda's input. And of course, the next steps, remember this webinar's aim is to help the participant get the most from their 360 report, the key messages that are coming through. So the focus is really on the first feedback session, but in our model, our ideal model, we suggest a second feedback session that deals specifically with action planning. And that follows a process that takes place in between. Now, we'll say more about those further 2 steps before we finish. But let's start with the setup. So the focus of this slide is on what you and the participant need to do to prepare for the session. Now, more and more feedback sessions are being done virtually these days. And I don't think that's just our company. We're doing more of this ourselves, but I believe this is the trend across the industry. And I suspect that the reasons are pretty obvious. It cuts down on the time, it cuts down on travel, it cuts down on cost, because typically we will charge less for a virtual coaching session than we will for a face-to-face. But whether your session is face-to-face or virtual, the place where it takes place needs to be private. So that's the first row on this slide. It applies to both. And you want to be somewhere where neither of you will be interrupted. So if it's a virtual session, and if you're running it from home, you want to keep the dogs and the children well away. For yourself, it's vital that you're in place early, especially if the session is virtual, with all your equipment fired up and ready to start. We were for this session, but for some reason, as soon as I started the broadcast, I lost the ability to share my screen. I'm sure there's a setting somewhere that I've misunderstood. I can see Percy agrees that most of his coaching is virtual, and I'm assuming that because America is such a vast continent, that is a practical solution as much as anything else. But yeah, you want to be ready to start a long way before the session. So we used to use GoToMeeting for our virtual sessions, but these days we use Zoom, an online meeting platform. Belinda, how reliable has virtual coaching been in your experience?
I think on the whole, it works well, but I think the important thing is you need to have a backup. Technology can fail, so you've got to be prepared to flex and adapt as you need to.
Yeah, it's interesting because we now have a digital Click 360 report, and that requires, actually this is true whether you're meeting somebody virtually or face-to-face, but it requires the participant to have that report sometime in advance and upload it onto their computer desktop ready for the session, because Belinda will typically swap screens. In other words, she'll make the coachee, the participant, the presenter, and that way both of them are looking at the participant's screen. Belinda, can you just share your experience in getting reports to the participant? What have you found works best?
I suppose there's 2 different schools of thought, really. I know some coaches prefer to reveal the 360 as part of the session. My preference, personal preference, is to forward the report a few hours in advance of the session. So it gives them time to upload it, it gives them time to scan it, but it's not long enough for them to start questioning anybody else about the feedback before you've had a chance to properly debrief it with them. So that's personally what I find has worked best. And to use the time, quite often you'll go on the call, and despite the fact that you've asked for the digital report to be uploaded in advance, for whatever reason it hasn't happened. And I just use that time really to set the scene and to find out a little bit more about the participant if I haven't met them. So that's my approach.
Yeah, okay. And the third row on this is about having the PC or laptop with the report on there. The fourth one is having a good Wi-Fi connection, because our digital Click 360 report requires an internet connection, whether the session is face-to-face or virtual. It's important that Wi-Fi is enabled and operating reliably. Having said that, we do have this PDF file alternative. Now, Belinda just referred to it there. I know there've been situations where you've had to revert to the PDF version. Can you say more about that, Belinda?
Yeah, I mean, we've had clients in the military, and they've been in places where they just can't access digital, and so we've resorted to the phone and PDF, looking at the PDF report, and that works fine. The only disadvantage is that obviously you're not sharing screens, so you're relying on your participant to be really clear about where they are in the report. The instructions you give have got to be very clear, etc. But it works, and it's a useful backup.
One of the points about the digital report is that it has an inbuilt workbook, and that of course allows the participant to capture, if they wish, to capture notes and reflections as they're working with you on the debrief. The next slide outlines our 3-stage approach to giving feedback. Now, we're just going to focus on the first stage in this webinar. Let me show it to you. So checking out the feedback, which is the middle stage in this model, is pretty crucial in our experience. Now, we'll deal with it briefly later, but we'll also mention the next webinar that we're going to offer will be all about the checking out process. We're happy to give away our IP in the hope that we attract new customers. It's a very important step in our experience. We'll also mention the development planning stage in passing today, but both of these 2 stages will eventually be covered by later webinars. Now, before we can facilitate anybody's 360, we need to consider our role as facilitators and feedback coaches, which is what the next sequence of slides looks at. By the way, my style with slideshows is to give you a few moments to absorb what's written. So I don't normally talk over them. I let you reflect on what's written, and then I'll go through some of these points, picking up things of importance. By the way, these points are not necessarily in sequence. I just numbered them to make referring to them easier. So point 1 is about reminding them of the purpose of the 360, why the organization sees it as beneficial, and hopefully a focus on development rather than assessment. Points 2 and 3 are both about helping the participant to interpret the report and to become aware of others' perceptions. Point 4 may require you to be challenging, as appropriate. And those last 2 points remind you that your role is also to ground them and to support them emotionally and practically. Before raising any comments or observations, you might just want to take a look at the second slide in this sequence. Just regarding point 7, the top point, I'll say more about the distinction between intent and impact a little later. Point 8 may be required if they disagree with the feedback, or as in point 9, if they're tending to defend or to justify their behavior. Please remember to focus on strengths first, that's point 10, and know how to recognize and deal with discounting. That's nothing, that's nothing to worry about, it's nothing important. That's discounting behavior. I guess you guys will know exactly what I'm talking about. We'll talk briefly today about point 11, checking out. Remember, that's going to be the subject of a separate webinar, but that may require your persuasive powers, as you'll see. And remember, the end point, the goal, which is the last but one point, is development planning, leading to development actions. Regards the last point, just remind them of the confidentiality contract. It's their report, and it's up to them who they share it with. Actually, I'll talk about confidentiality in just a second, go into that in a little bit more depth. But in most of the contracting that we do with the organization, we make it very clear that this report is the participants. And then for completeness, I thought it would make sense to show you what is not our role as feedback coaches. But you knew that anyway, right? So finally, the bottom line slide.
It hasn't changed, Colin.
Oh, I beg your pardon. There we go. That's the bottom line. Facilitating feedback, the bottom line. So anything to add to that sequence of slides, Belinda?
No, I mean, I think for me, the role is about helping the participant answer the so what question. It's what perceptions do I want, or do I need to change to enable me to achieve what I want to achieve? And I think ultimately that's what we're there to help them with.
Okay, so if that's our role as facilitator or feedback coach, the next slide looks at what skills do we need to demonstrate. Now, just take a look at the words, and once again, I'll summarize. Now, what we have on this slide are really just the basic skills expected of a coach. I'm sure you're all okay with that. If there's anything that you think is missing or you want to comment on, please again use the chat box while the webinar is live. Now look, we've always maintained that most 360-degree feedback reports contain a lot of affirmations about things the participant is doing well, their strengths, in other words. Very often the participant is pleasantly surprised to read these things, and in some cases they had no idea that something they were doing or not doing and or saying or not saying had such a profound positive impact. It's a nice feeling to be appreciated. In fact, in our office, we had a new financial coordinator start this week, and she had experienced just this result with a 360 in her previous job. So obviously, you will want to start drilling down to these strengths early on in the session to focus on those first. But as well, there will doubtless be some feedback that suggests that the participant could be doing or not doing and or saying or not saying some things differently. And we call these areas for development. It's rare that the information here will come as a huge surprise, although in fact, something I want to share at this point is very often the participant is in complete agreement with the negative feedback. But I can't help wondering, if the feedback is so negative, why can't you do something about it? Why the heck haven't you taken action already to correct it? Anyway, it does happen. And for that reason, I wanted to show a model for how humans tend to deal with receiving negative feedback. Now, it's important that we're mindful of this in connection with 360-degree feedback. So it's the journey that an individual may go on when receiving negative feedback. Now, I can't remember who it is that developed this model originally. I'm guessing most of you will be familiar with it. You'll have seen it along the way somewhere. As I said just now, very often there are a lot of strengths that emerge from someone's 360-degree feedback. It's not all bad news. And that's where we should start our journey of discovery. Nevertheless, this slide reminds us of our duty of care with anyone processing negative feedback. Belinda, you've also got something to say about the way that people deal with positive feedback.
No, it's just that I think that for some people, this emotional journey is as relevant if they're receiving positive feedback. If they are someone who actually doesn't enjoy getting positive feedback, some people believe it's enough for them to know they're doing a good job, and they're almost embarrassed to hear the good things. So from experience, I would say that there are some people receiving positive feedback that have the same journey. It's just maybe the time they spend in the early bit. I always think if we can get somebody to acceptance as quickly as possible, they are then in a position to start looking forward. Until then, that's when the defensive mechanisms come into play, and they keep looking about trying to justify feedback or think about the past. So I think it can be as relevant for receiving positive feedback as negative feedback.
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, this is again where the discounting that I mentioned earlier can come in, and we need to work with that. So the next slide shows some of the key behaviors that we need to deploy in our role as 360 coaches. Again, have a look at the detail and I'll go through it with you in a moment. So this slide is more about the way we need to show up and the way we need to be during the session. It's about our behavior. And the first point's focused on development. 360 can be used for assessment, but it's not our preference. And if that is how you're going to use it, such implementations need to be pretty carefully managed. Point 2 requires us to contract clearly with each participant at the start of the session. Confidentiality is referred to specifically in the third point, but it really does depend on the way in which you've contracted with the client. I know, Belinda, you wanted to say something about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think normally I work on the basis that the report and the content of the discussions that take place during the debrief and any subsequent coaching are confidential, and none of the detail will be shared, except, and there are a couple of exceptions, I think primarily where there is a risk either to the individual or to the organisation which you've contracted with. It happens very rarely, but if, for example, I was concerned about somebody's well-being as a result of the session, I'd talk to them first, but I think it's my responsibility to be able to identify potentially they're at risk and to do something about that. The other exception is about sharing organisational themes, particularly if you're working with a cohort of participants. Often you pick up on maybe some things that are going on within the organization. Is it communication that's the blockage? Where are the blockages? What's helping the organization? Or quite often, what are the barriers that are in there? And it can be that those themes can be very useful to the organization. And I would always contract that I would feed back on those themes, but no feedback would be directly attributable to one individual. And I think most people are comfortable with that as an approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing is that if the contract has been set up, what I would say professionally and properly with the organisation, then a copy of that report is not going to be stored in the personnel file. It's the property of the individual participant. And even though we will encourage them to share it, and that's what the checking out process is all about, it's not mandatory, and it's certainly not shared by us.
I think it might be worth just jumping in here quickly and just saying that I would always encourage the participant to share the feedback with their line manager. If there's reluctance because of the relationship, I think at the very least we would encourage them to share the action plan that comes out of it to ensure that they've got the support to actually implement that action plan and take it forward.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you. The next slide is actually just a continuation of the same theme. It's about more of the behaviours. So point 4, the first of those, if we're truly starting with strengths, then we may need to keep pulling them back to those and to return to them when we're looking for ways to minimize or eradicate any of the areas for development. Point 5 refers to the possibility of having a difficult conversation, so we need to be good at that. And regards point 7, I'll talk about that in the do's and don'ts on the next slide. There are some other obstacles. I haven't put them on the slide, but I know, Belinda, you run an exercise sometimes, especially when you're doing a train the trainer session. You're helping individuals inside an organization to become feedback coaches. And that exercise involves further potential obstacles that may come up and how to deal with them. Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I'm sure as David and Percy are experienced coaches, these won't surprise them as potential things to happen. I think you've already talked about discounting, and that probably is, I think, the most common, if you like, initial barrier for the participant to be able to process and to make the most of the data that they've got. For me, it's all about perceptions and reminding them that feedback is a perception. It's not right or wrong. And the important question I always think is how is this perception going to stop me achieving what I want to achieve? And often I find that question is enough to actually help somebody move on and think, well, okay, what can I do? The other thing, particularly where the program maybe is sponsored by a client organization and somebody doesn't, is a reluctant participant, and therefore they're not particularly engaged or committed to the process. And I think this is about the courageous conversations that Colin mentioned. I think it is about vocalizing what you're seeing and hearing in a way that is cannot be seen as a sort of attack. So, it is things like saying, I'm sensing that, I'm hearing that. And I think the other common barrier that I find is where individuals are really focused in on who said what and trying to identify. And again, I think for me, the importance of that is about bringing people back to focusing in on the what rather than the who. So those are sort of three, I think they're commonly experienced potential barriers.
Thank you. Okay, let me go back to the slides. So let's look at the do's and don'ts. This is a slide that is designed for participants, not so much you as coaches. So this is what you might contract with them at the beginning of the session. Now, on the left-hand side, the do column, we've got some words in italics there. That sort of phrase is our mantra. It's the Click 360 mantra. It's our justification. It's our reason for 360-degree feedback. At the bottom, on the left, is a statement about intent versus impact. You remember I referred to that earlier on. What we really mean here is that a participant may genuinely and sincerely have intended a positive message by their behavior, which is something they did or said, or something they didn't do, or something they didn't say. But the way it landed was negative. That can happen a lot. And I say this, I repeat the word sincerely. They sincerely intended it to be a positive message, unless, of course, they didn't, and they meant it negatively. That's what we mean by that phrase, that statement. Okay, well, let's move on to how we, as a company, and how our coaches tend to interpret a 360 report. Now, this is where it's going to be quite difficult, because in the setup, we did a dry run of this yesterday. We wanted to show some of the report pages of one of our reports. Unfortunately, the webinar software seems to have prevented me from doing this once we went live with the broadcast, which is a great disappointment, and I don't know how to do that, how to get it back. But anyway, the objectives of the session, and this again is where I'm sure you guys know this already. But what I want to do is try and cover this without having a report on screen. Although the report that I was going to share was one of ours, I think it's important that we recognize most 360 reports, and trust me, I've seen most of them. They do look similar to ours. The difference with ours is perhaps the fact that it's now digital, and it has the integrated workbook, but pretty much the layout, the pictures and so on are the same. So I think what we're going to cover is relevant to any 360 report. So in our world, we break the report into several parts, and each of those parts is supported by a step in the workbook. Again, this is where I wanted to show it to you. I can't, although actually I'll show you the web address, our web address at the end, and you'll be able to see an example of what I've talked about on our website. But for now, accept that the purple boxes are the workbook steps. The green boxes underneath are the parts of the report that they actually refer to. So if I now break this down, what I wanted to show you was we've actually got a handout for this, the approach that we use. It's a 2-page flowchart, and it talks about what you might do and what pages of the report are relevant and so on. If you stay to the end of this webinar, I'll ensure that you get instruction how to get hold of that handout. So if we take the first of these steps, step 1, analyze the main patterns and trends. What happens in our report is that we offer 3 different visual displays of the summary data, 3 different views, which allow for different visual preferences and different learning styles. So in our report, there's a bar chart, a spidergram, and a table, a tabular format. They all say the same thing. They all have the same data in them, but they're just different ways of seeing that data. And we tend to support that part of the report with some typical questions. Belinda, can you come in and share some of the things you would ask at this point?
I think because it's the overview, it's a great way to actually start the participant off in terms of looking at the data and thinking about what it means for them. So it is simple questions like, what do you notice? What stands out for you? And it's really drawing their attention to maybe trends or patterns that you see, maybe different rater category perceptions. You know, often you might have an individual that maybe their own self-perception is actually very different to one or all of the other categories. So it's almost a snapshot. It allows them to get a sense of what the feedback, the more detailed feedback is likely to give them.
Yeah, I know that internally we tend to use the term overrater for a client, for a participant who sees himself or herself as more than the rater category aggregate sees them. And we call them underraters if the opposite is true. In fact, I think we see more underraters than overraters. But that may be because we work mainly with British people. That's just the starting point, and it's a good place to start because there's quite a lot of data, I think, that can come out of those summary pictures. Then what we do is we move to a more detailed approach, which is, again, something I can't show you on screen, but it's where we take each behavior in turn and or each cluster of questions, each competency, if you like, and then we focus first on the bar charts, which are at the top, which is a bar chart that simply shows the participants' self-score across the questions in that cluster, compared to the aggregated score of all of the raters that were involved in one bar. And we focus on that first, and then underneath that picture is a bar chart for every question, which reflects the same image or view of the summary data as the very first bar chart. It has a color coding and so on, but it's designed for each question, drilling down to each question within the cluster. When we get to this part of the report, Belinda, what are some of the questions you ask or prompts that you might make there?
I think one of the things that I think can be really helpful at this section is that within those bar charts, you can actually see the spread of ratings within each category. So if you've got 5 direct reports, it actually breaks down the scores, obviously just anonymously, but you get a marker as to where each of their scores are. And if you look at that picture overall, you might see that there is somebody who consistently, and it could be the same person, might not be, but where there's a low score or there might be a particularly high score. And I think where that becomes helpful for the participant is to be thinking about, why are people experiencing me differently? Why do they have these different perceptions of me? And I think it's important at that point that our role is really to highlight that it's differences of 20% or more that will be statistically significant. And often the scores raise a lot of questions for individuals, and that's the point at which I say, those are just the scores on the doors. What we need to look at and consider are the comments, and it's often the comments that give us that richness give us far more information.
Yeah, so this is the piece at the end of each cluster where we show the comments expressed by rater category, not by individual. There's no attribution here, but we also show the self comments, and we're comparing those to comments from other rater categories. And there's one of those pages for each of the behavioral clusters. So you have about, well, as many pages as there are clusters of questions as there are competencies or behaviors. Now,
that data specifically asks the question what somebody is doing well and what they could be doing differently. And that becomes a really useful way. Invariably, people will look at what I could be doing differently first, but actually you can bring them back and focus them in on the strengths as well. The comments are really useful.
And that leads on to, in our report, a step in the workbook that brings in the highest and the lowest ratings part of the report. So it's just a table showing the top 10 and the bottom 10, and these are actual questions, as well as on the page following, the comments that are offered through our stop, start, continue page in the questionnaire. So the last page of the questionnaire is actually a question page that asks, what would you like the participant to stop doing, start doing, or continue doing? So that in itself adds depth and clarity to the data that we've already seen up to this point. And the workbook step also encourages further reflection around the detailed analysis graphs and comments, behavior by behavior. So by the end of that step, the participants should have a pretty good idea of what they're doing well, their strengths, and what they could do differently as perceived by their raters. Belinda, what are some of the words you might use around that step?
I think the highest and lowest is useful to focus the participants again on strengths, but also potential development areas. Personally, I particularly like the stop, start, continue. I think because it's free form, it often can introduce data which there hasn't been an opportunity for the rater to share previously. And I think the focus is on the future. So it's not so much on the past. And I think particularly that's helpful for the individual when they're thinking about the so what am I going to do?
Yeah. Yeah. And if we move to the next part of the workbook, which is step 4, which is the summarizing part, we refer to a page in the report which is called the scatter chart, and it's actually based on the Johari window model. Now, most of you will be familiar with the Johari window, but you'll need to explain that to the participant in most cases. You may even need to explain the expanded scale in the image. In our report, the digital report, there's actually a button to enlarge the scale, expand the scale of the Johari window feedback. And that's calculated by taking the range of scores that have actually been registered. So you're drilling down to the actual range of scores, not a 0 to 100 scale, which is what you get before you press the button, but you get the scale that starts with 2 percentage points below the lowest score recorded and finishes 2 percentage points above the highest score recorded. So what it does, it's like drilling down into the data, and it really does help reveal development opportunities. The other part of the workbook in step 4 actually allows people to access some of the development suggestions that might help them improve in that area. So we give that opportunity in step 4 of the workbook. If I move, I notice we're approaching time out, so I just want to finish with the overview of the report. There are pages of the report, which I'm not covering. There's a benchmarking page I'm not going to cover on this section. Number 5, this is the workbook step 5, really is a generic part of the workbook or step of the workbook, which asks more specific questions to narrow down the participants' conclusions. And this is in readiness for the upcoming action planning step. If I move to the step 6 of the report, sorry, I should have changed the slide. So step 5 is bringing people to a conclusion, and step 6 is actually a grid that sits in the workbook, which allows the participant to capture the most developed strength, plus up to 3 key development priorities. Now, this grid is actually tied to an automated checking out function in the Click 360 software. It's actually not often used during a coaching session. I think, Belinda, you would agree with that.
Yeah, no, it's not often used, the automated option, but I do use the grid to help clients focus on their development priorities. And if I have a follow-up action planning session, I always ask them to have completed at least to this point before having that discussion, as I find it really helps them focus on what they want to do.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so step 7 and step 8, which are the 2 final steps in the workbook, again, they're not referring to specific pages in the report. These are generically inviting participants to share their reflections using, by the way, when I talk about it as a workbook, there are many sections within the workbook that are forms that they fill in. They type their reflections into the workbook, and it captures that as they type them. So they've got not only the report, but also their interpretation, their analysis, their reflections within the one document. Now, we encourage all participants to check out their conclusions with their line manager. Belinda already mentioned that. In the next webinar, we're going to go into more depth about what the checking out process is. But for today, we ask you just to accept that this process, checking out, has transformed the quality of participants' action plans. Plus, it's kept the whole 360 process more alive. You know, it's kept it much more dynamic, keeps it going. Okay, Belinda, I know there have been some situations where it's not been possible to reconvene for a second feedback coaching session, which is focused on action planning. What have you done in those cases?
I think it's really encouraged the participant to use the workbook as their virtual coach. I would end the session with very much so what do they get from it, and look at a high level step 6, so that they've drawn some preliminary conclusions, but at the same time acknowledge that they may change. And I think you really have to judge on each individual, because for some, particularly if their report is very rich in data, then maybe their rated categories, they've had a lot of raters, there can be a sense of overwhelm. So I think it's really about tailoring to the individual. No different than coaching.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Okay, so that's it. That's the coaching around the 360 report in all its glory. What's on screen now is an overview of all the steps that we follow. We hope you found the webinar useful. Before we open up the floor to any final questions or comments or suggestions, can you just use the info@ address on the next slide if you'd like a copy of the handout? Just make a note of that. And as well, I've got a quick poll for you. Just a very quick one to finish with. Let me bring that up for you. If you scroll down, you'll see there's a question right at the bottom of the poll, which is about the next webinar. I appreciate your response to that question. we'll make sure to invite you in that case. Great stuff. Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, David, for your feedback. Percy has had to sign out already. That's great. He'll get a copy of the recording, of course. The checking out webinar will be at some time in July, probably towards the end. And again, it'll be recorded. But if you sign up for it, even if you can't make the date, then you'll get a copy of the recording. I'm going to just show the last slide, which is the any questions slide, and encourage anyone still with us to use the chat box to ask a question or to put in David's commented, by the way, I heard 50% of you, Belinda. He changed his browser. Good man. Thank you very much, David. We hope that the bits you heard were inspiring. Thank you, Belinda, for all of your inputs on this webinar.
Well,
the recording will be sent automatically. And once again, my thanks to David for attending and to Percy earlier. And we'll see you on the next one. Okay, David's asked, just as we're closing, do you send out the slides? The answer is no, I don't. The report sample is in the website. You're quite right, David. But we do send out a recording of the webinar. So you've got the slides there. You can always take screen grabs or whatever. But thank you very much indeed for participating. And we hope that we can serve you going forward. Thank you also to Belinda, and we'll speak soon.
Pleasure.
This is us signing out. Thank you.